Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to what is now our second Movers and Shakers virtual event. My name's Natasha Salter, and I'm Managing Director of Movers and Shakers. We've got 700 people registered for today's event, so we're absolutely delighted, and we welcome a number of new virtual attendees. Welcome to our event. For those of you who don't know Movers and Shakers, we're the UK's leading property networking forum. We've been going now for over 25 years. We're a family business and we're absolutely passionate about connecting our members, enabling business and to put on first-class speaker events. We've postponed our physical events now until September, so we've created a series of Movers and Shakers virtual events. We've made these free of charge. We want them to be accessible to everybody and to play our part in helping during these difficult times. So we're going to have a number of market insights events such as today, a series of webinars, panel discussions. We held one on Tuesday. That's now uploaded onto our YouTube channel, so take a look. We'll also be creating a series of Monday morning motivations to kickstart your week and some chief executive interviews viewed from the top. Lots to look forward to, but back to this morning. I'm absolutely delighted this morning for our first market insight to introduce to you Ben Page. Ben is Chief Executive of Ipsos MORI. He's going to talk to you this morning about UK Unlocked. How will society and business change? So he's going to be looking at the global pandemic for its impact onto how we live, work and play. Clearly we've been in lockdown 3 weeks, some of us 4 weeks now. Quite a few changes to our life-work balance. We're working remotely, we're interacting, communicating with colleagues, with customers, with markets, relying on technology and with our friends and our families. So what's going to happen post-lockdown? What changes are we going to retain? What changes are we going to discard? We're going to have economic debt, we're going to have lack of investment, and most likely our personal savings are depleted. So who better than to tell us the most likely scenarios than Ben? Ben has been 11 years Chief Executive of Ipsos MORI. Ipsos MORI is the third largest global market research business. Ben has huge insights and understanding into society, markets and people. So over to Ben. If you want to ask him some questions, there's a Q&A tab. Do type in a question and we'll try our very best to add them in at the end of the session. Thanks very much. I'll pass you over to Ben. Thank you.
Right. So I think the first thing to remember as we go into this is that, of course, most predictions are always wrong. This on the right here is one of the men who to win an Oscar early in the 20th century, and he said, when a century has passed, all thought of so-called speaking pictures would have been abandoned. This is an Oscar winner. He knows the industry. It will never be possible to synchronize the sound of the picture. They did it 2 years later. My friend Tom Peters, who many of you older people in the audience would have read his books, In Search of Excellence, Lessons from America's Best Run Companies. This sold millions of copies in the 1980s. Everybody at airports was reading it. And within 3 years, a third of the companies mentioned in there were either bankrupt or in severe financial difficulties. Now, this doesn't mean that Tom is a charlatan, and he's on Twitter today, so you can talk to him. But it just means that, to use a colloquial English expression, shit happens. And I think, whichever sector you look at, if we look at, this is people in the city predicting American treasury rates, you can see the actual treasury rates in the blue line going down and down and down. And you can see the economists' collective forecasts of what was going to happen. And they stay in their jobs and they're wrong year after year. When we asked the general public last year what was going to be the biggest threat to their health, they were wrong about that. They said that they were likely the biggest issue was cancer, obesity, diabetes, maybe pollution, and only 4 people in 100 mentioned something like influenza, AIDS, or indeed COVID-19. So all of us, most of the time, are wrong. And so it's, me telling you that I'm going to predict exactly what's going to happen as a result of COVID-19 is probably not going to happen. Pollsters are very accurate. I mean, we predicted the general election to 0.3% accuracy. But of course, that was done on the Tuesday before the general election on a Thursday. So predicting how lockdown will unfold, how spending will resume or not resume is really, really tricky. But there are some things we do know. So these are the macro forces facing the world. And these are the known knowns. So we know that our population, demography is destiny. We know that Europe, even with COVID-19, will end up being the oldest continent on Earth. We know that unless Italian women decide they can put up with Italian men, the Italians will become extinct in 170 years because their birth rate just isn't enough to replace their death rate. We know that there's growing inequality and opportunity, and indeed COVID-19, in a very bitter type of way, is likely to exacerbate some of those inequalities, both in Europe and in America, with the people who are going to die at the greatest rates from COVID-19 will, of course, be people who are already in deprived circumstances, in poor quality housing and overcrowding. Geopolitical tensions, again, those are here, and there is no sign, at least with Donald Trump in the White House, of those disappearing anytime soon. We've moved from a world of the late 20th century built around the United Nations and the Washington Consensus to one of sort of conflicts. And there are some signs that we'll come to on that. Again, data world, again, I won't go into that, but we have loads and loads of data. It's changing what we do. Technology tipping points, I think, is an interesting one, because what we're seeing more and more is that many of the innovations that are changing our lives, indeed the one that I'm talking to you on today, for example, are not the result of a single new invention, but indeed a series of things that come together in unexpected ways. So Uber, to have Uber, which has disrupted taxi services, you need GPS to be invented, you need the internet to be invented, you need the smartphone to be invented, and radio technology and miniaturization. You need aerial technology to advance, and suddenly those things come together and you have a massive disruption. And finally, of course, the fragile planet. And even without COVID-19, we had record levels of anxiety about climate change. And indeed, at the beginning of this year, that's what I thought was going to be one of the main topics of conversation in boardrooms, in government around the world, was the acceleration of global warming. But instead, of course, we have this little virus, microns small, but of course massively upending our world. And of course, but it is similarly related to the fragility of the ecosystem that humanity has created. Most experts say that we had MERS, we had SARS, we got off lightly with those, and it may be that this latest outbreak of COVID-19 is a forerunner of more of these types of things that we will see, partly as a result of climate change. So those are the known knowns. We at Ipsos Mori see the way the world changes as a mixture of those macro forces, the known knowns, impacting on human society in terms of trends, which we measure, and I want to talk about today. And then, of course, we can see signals. To use a simple example of how all these play out together, one macro force, of course, is climate change. One trend that is accelerating is people becoming interested in not eating less meat, in plant-based food diets. Many of you, if you're in London, would have seen Lamb and Wolf, which of course doesn't sell any lamb or any wolf at all. It's a vegan-based, plant-based chain of restaurants. But a signal, of course, another signal there is, of course, Greggs selling vegan sausage rolls. And COVID-19 is, in one sense, an immediate shock into this ecosystem. And we can see a whole set of signals coming as a result of COVID-19. So, for example, we can see Pornhub offering you free Pornhub premium while you're in lockdown. You can see gaming growth massively accelerating. As soon as we went into lockdown in Europe, Xbox crashed. There were so many people online. You can see society potentially becoming more caring. We've got opening hours for vulnerable people in supermarkets. We have in Italy balcony bingo. We have joint exercise classes on balconies with Joe Wicks online. We bump elbows if we do meet people at all, or we stay 2 meters away from them. We have a whole new set of confrontations. Trump trying to blame the virus on the Chinese, may have a point. Gen Z, born after 1995, blaming people like me, having destroyed the planet and about to be potentially wiped out by as an older man by COVID-19. Boomers care but not about the planet. We have bad science, like, you know, people going around setting fire to 5G masts because they've been told that it causes COVID-19. That's one thing I can tell you today, ladies and gentlemen. 5G does not cause COVID-19, and we're certain of that. So we can see all of those signals, and that starts to give us some idea about how things may change. Just to show you the sort of framework that we're using, and there's a website that you can go to and read a detailed report on this or look at this in more detail. This is based on hundreds of questions sorted by computer into the values that we share in this country. So you can see here, for example, a set of values of people who often perhaps feel left behind, many Brexit voters, some older people feeling overwhelmed, nostalgic for the past, interested in populist revolution against the elites, worried about technology. Many people on a Zoom call in business are probably more likely to share some of these values, probably believe that globalization has positives, believe that capitalism, despite its faults, is probably the best system, into early adoption of new technologies like Zoom, like technology, generally believe that medicine, you know, people in medicine know what they're talking about, even a little bit of hedonism. Down here on the bottom left is Nigel Farage, Mr. Bolsonaro of Brazil, and probably Mr. Trump. Here we've got people who are fed up, they share the values of actually being fed up with environmentalism. It's made up. They believe that men and women have traditional roles and they should know their place. They believe my country, right or wrong, make America great again. Britain will be set free to go off and do its own thing. Materialism and achievement and real world shopping. And they're a long way from the values of many of our children, who are often very concerned about the climate emergency and also beyond binary, which we don't have a lot of time to go into now. But it's the values of people who are really concerned about gender equality, who really are concerned about trans rights and LGBT rights, and who believe that there are definitely more than two genders. There may be two sexes, but there are many more than just you know, straight and gay in terms of gender, the beyond binary group. And in the middle are values of lots of very discerning people who are probably on this call, around conscious eating, discerning consumption, individualism, thinking about where the food comes from, etc. So we use those values which the world shares to understand which of these values might be changed under COVID-19. They group into 12 trends. I don't have time to talk to you about those today, but I'll come back to some of these because it's looking at how these are changing or might be influenced by COVID-19 that lets us see how the planet might evolve. But what I would say, and I think this is a key point, many people will be saying, well, the world, when we come out of lockdown, will be fundamentally different. But actually, as I will show you in a second, values don't necessarily shift anywhere near as quickly as some people are imagining. And it takes some time for a new normal to be created. I think also, as we come out of lockdown, it will take some time for us to work out what usage of offices in central London is going to be like in future. Because I don't think we're suddenly all going to have one day and we're all going to suddenly go back to how we were working in February. So, this is just, but on the other hand, some things don't change. So this chart shows you Britain between 1999 and 2019. In 1999, only 13% of us were online. Obviously today it's about 93% or even more. We've had 9/11, we've had Facebook, we've had the financial crash, we've had the inventions of technology like Amazon Alexa. And yet you can see that exactly the same proportion of people say they want to slow down their lives, exactly the same proportion of people before Facebook, before smartphones, before WhatsApp are still saying technical progress is destroying our lives. In terms of the importance of getting on in the rat race, there's been no difference at all. And this idea that everybody themselves must work out their own principles rather than perhaps waiting for government or somebody to tell us what to do. Again, no real difference at all in the data. There are, of course, some differences. This is what's happened on drugs and sex over the last 30 years, since 1989. So in 1989, internet penetration was obviously 0. And you can see using hard drugs like heroin is morally wrong. That's gone down. So has the proportion of people who think using cannabis is wrong. We've got the proportion who say being gay is morally wrong has gone down from 40% to 13%. So a massive shift. And we've seen no change, though, or pretty much no change, in the proportion who say it's wrong to have sex with someone who's married to someone else. So we don't approve of adultery, even if we do approve of soft drug use. And in terms of capital punishment, again, we've gone from 22% to 37%. So some values change, but many don't, even with some really big shocks like 9/11, like the collapse of the Soviet Union. So let's quickly look at the here and now and how people are responding to COVID-19, because I think some of that, of course, immediately gives us some signals of what will change in human society. I mean, and the biggest one, of course, and for those of us in business, a key one, if I can get the slides to move on temporarily. Does it let me? Very exciting. Sorry, everybody. Wait for latency to fix. Why are they doing that? Let me, while we wait for the machine to refresh itself, I mean, what we're seeing, of course, is massive falls in economic confidence. We've got now nearly as many people as in the height of the recession after 2008, within a space of months, saying that the economy is going to get worse rather than better, and they're probably right. We've also seen rising satisfaction with the government, which is, we are moving, if it will let me, don't know why it's not. Okay, so there's economic optimism. As you can see now, 69%, even at the end of May, saying that things were going to get worse, and they did. So it will be even more sharp. We've got a shift indeed in terms of support for Boris Johnson. He's gone from somebody who was quite Marmite to having people out clapping when he comes out of hospital, and 51% of us now say we're favourable to him. He's not doing as well as Mrs. Merkel in Germany, where her figure is 79%, but he's doing better than Mr. Trump, who's on 45%. And generally, something we see in times of crisis is a shift to support for the government of the day. That doesn't mean to say that everybody thinks the government is doing brilliantly. We've got 57% who say the measures they've taken were done too late, although that's slightly polarised by political support, with Labour supporters much more likely to say that, of course, than Conservative voters. But people aren't just saying that everything the government's doing is brilliant. They're certainly worried about the virus, more in terms of the economy and the country as a whole than themselves, but they are confident in the NHS. And one of the conundrums, of course, about this is that we've seen this rise in confidence in the NHS to deal with the virus. We've opened these huge hospitals at places like the NEC and also in Docklands. But of course, in the Nightingale Hospital in London at the weekend, there were only 19 of the beds occupied. And whereas the French have all rocked up to their intensive care units and packed them out, in Britain, there is still space because we're stoically choosing not to dial 999, and many of us, sadly, are dying at home. The number of people dying in London of heart attacks, according to the ambulance service, is now trebled. So there's a real challenge, of course, that it's not just the deaths from COVID-19 that we now face, but it's also the knock-on consequences of how we react to the virus. But people are very positive about the NHS. In terms of how people are spending their time, mostly, of course, being forced to spend more time with children where they have them, looking at social media, gardening and books for people of my age, 8% of us having more sex. Among the under 34s, that's 17%, but it doesn't look like a baby boom. And we've got people trying things like dancing around the house, knitting, and hot trying new skills. One of the pieces of evidence from China, interestingly, is that the time, of course, flies by during lockdown. And all of those, if you're planning to learn a new skill or learn a language, which 6% say they are, get cracking, because you'll find that even with another three or 4 weeks in lockdown, the time would have gone faster than you think. So here's the rise in things like online banking and online grocery shopping. We've got a quarter of the population saying they're doing these things more. General rises in, small rises in, sort of online GP services. But generally the evidence from China and of course here is more online, and the evidence will be that many of us have now become comfortable with tools like Zoom that we weren't really comfortable using before. And that starts to pose some really interesting questions. The other challenge from China is they start to release people back out of their compounds and blocks of flats, where they have literally guards waiting outside with temperature monitors, is that even as retail has reopened, and of course we might start by letting kids go back to school, we might start by opening some larger shops, but probably restaurants and cinemas will come later. What's happened in China so far, we've got 3,000 employees there, is that people are worried about their employment. They're still worried about the economic situation. And so even when they're let out to go shopping again, spending does not resume in the way it was before. And I think that's a real challenge in terms of the length of time it will take to get back. One thing that we can see, and we'll be releasing this in the newspapers tomorrow, so you've got an early snapshot of it, is there seems to be quite high levels of support for relatively draconian tracking of people through their phones to find out if you're following social distancing rules and fine people or penalise those. 49% of us in favour of that and only 29% opposed. You know, and generally, interestingly, young people are a little bit less supportive of most of those, but generally the population is up for quite high levels of surveillance. And of course, we've turned out to be more compliant, which is good in terms of quashing the peak, in terms of our overall, you know, staying at home, etc., and hopefully not spreading the virus. And generally in Britain, we are in the middle of the chart here. If I can put a mouse on it, I can't. And you can see that only about 27% of us currently think that things will be back to normal by June. That's much lower than in Italy, where in some ways it's been more dramatic. It's much lower than America, where it's 46%. So there's only a minority of people in Britain who even think that even after the next 3 weeks of lockdown, things will be back to normal, which is probably just as well. The British have turned out to be more stoic than expected. Now, even before the crisis, we had lots of people very worried about the future. These are the intensity with which those 36 values I showed you before were held, and one of the strongest, even before the crisis, was this fear of the future. One of the things that is most distinctive in Britain, along with massively changed attitudes to things like homosexuality and liberal values over the last 40 years, is the shift that there was even before the start of this crisis about the loss of the future. So in Britain, at the end of 2019, 45% of us expected our children to be poorer than us. Before the 2008 crash, that was only 12%. So a massive shift. And of course, many of the things that we're looking at there are things like, reactions against that, regulate big tech. You've got wealth redistribution, you can see on this chart. And we can see that all over the world, lots of people saying rich people should pay more tax, inequality is bad, and lots of people all over the world. That's actually the same figure in Britain as it is globally. The economy of my country is rigged to advantage the rich and powerful. This does not mean that Labour are storming ahead in the polls. They're certainly not. And the Conservatives are miles ahead of the Labour Party, even under Keir Starmer's new leadership. But it does mean that there is dissatisfaction with the way things are. People want business to speak up on what's happening, whether they're baby boomers like me or Gen Zs at 24 and younger. And it means for brands and for, if we're in business communicating, that authenticity is king. It's one of the things that we can see from this huge survey that we do every 3 years. We see, yeah. So, you can see all over the world people wanting to buy brands that reflect their personal values, and that sort of, that being able to identify with the brand that does the right thing, reflects the sort of person you are, is hugely important. We've got nostalgia as an almost permanent feature of our societies now. We've got half of us globally want the country to be how it used to be. Now, we don't necessarily mean going back to making homosexuality illegal, which it was when I was born in 1965, but we do mean those bits of the past that we find particularly attractive. And it's interesting, the Chinese, of course, don't want to go back to the past because they can remember when grannies starved to death in the 1950s. But in many Western countries, America, France, Britain, there's a large proportion of people who are very attracted to this idea of the past, and many people, of course, will play on that. There's also a search for simplicity and meaning. This isn't changing, and I think, to be honest, it will stay with us through the virus, which we can see in the data, in the sense of people feeling overwhelmed by technology. They always do, and that doesn't seem to be changing. We seem to be stuck here, which is a shame. So let's see if I can get these slides up again. I'll just keep talking. One thing that is true is that we have 63% telling us that they want okay, that's moving again, good. They want their life to be simpler. So how do you offer people solutions that curate things, etc. And I think one of the things that lockdown is producing, which we'll see in a minute, is some people reflecting that actually not catching the 6 o'clock train every morning to travel for an hour into central London and then travel on the tube to my office is really quite attractive. And I'm finding I'm getting quite a lot done. We've also got hedonism rising. People just saying, well, look, buying a house for me in my 30s is appearing to be almost impossible. So let's just enjoy life today. Tomorrow will take care of itself. And of course, being in lockdown, one of the best ways to get through it is literally to treat every day as it comes and not to think too much about the future. But what we can see then finally, as advertised, is some signals about how the world might be changing. And so the first is that if we talk about climate as one of the uniting values around the world, you can see this world coming where people are saying, well, actually, you're doing social distancing. This is an article in the New York Times. Of course, you're fighting climate change now. Many of you, I did a little informal poll and found that about 70% of Londoners now say, yes, of course, if the air feels much better. And you've got antagonism, of course, towards older generations and younger people. Do we see people saying, actually, we now need to, when we reopen, we need to reopen in a different way? Or is it more like 2008, where the governments pile everything into letting building rip, letting everything rip, all construction projects must resume at high speed, get the airports open, get it all going again? We don't know, but certainly that is going to be one of the debates as we come out of climate change. The tech dimension, I think, is obvious, that we've now all become used to we're finding out that we can run our businesses without offices. And certainly my office in London, I was due a rent review. The landlord has gone very quiet about that. I'm certainly not volunteering it. And I'm wondering when I'm actually going to be ever using that office, even if I was allowed to, whether I would ever use it in the same way. And whereas before I was constantly looking for new office space as an organisation that was growing, I almost certainly won't be in future. We've got a trend towards wanting to regulate big tech, but as I've shown you, it may be that one of the ways out of lockdown is actually to live in a society where we have far more monitoring of our behaviour, and people are willing to let the NHS monitor their behaviour, if not HMRC. And so that, again, may lead to a very different sort of world where you might know where all your workers are at one time, you're monitoring them on their screens, the NHS is monitoring you to see who you've been in contact with, and technology becomes, we've got some new solutions which are rapidly come online, make remote working even easier, and big offices become, basically demand drops quite markedly. It's certainly possible. We've also got, of course, all of these threats to the world order, whether it's people being so anxious about the future that they decide that they really want to listen to populists again, traditional nationalism, it's all the Chinese fault, and America, we must build walls against foreigners. We're banning at the moment flights from other countries. And as we go out of lockdown and planes start flying again, which countries are we going to let in? At the moment, Britain is allowing anybody to fly in without any testing at all. But as we come out of lockdown, will we feel so easy about that, or will something change? So, or do we say, actually, this is a wake-up call to the world, rather than not funding the World Health Organization as Donald Trump has done, we actually need to build in much more resilience. That might be resilience between countries and in terms of global institutions, or it might mean that, countries now realize they need to have lots of hospital beds, they need to have lots of biotech, they need all sorts of things here, not in China. Again, we don't know which way that will go. We do know that nostalgia is likely to be with us. And one reaction that we saw in 2008 to squeezed incomes, and we're seeing some signs of it too at the moment, forced by COVID-19, is, there's been a massive rise in sales of puzzles and jigsaws. There's home cooking, of course, by definition is massively more popular. But does it mean that actually people stop deciding, they've noticed that spending all that money on going to Pret, on commuting, and on those expensive meals in restaurants, on those expensive holidays, actually we found that we can live on about, currently according to the Office of National Statistics, we're spending a quarter less on average in Britain than we were before the crunch hit us. And to some of us go, well, actually, I quite like life like this, and it gives me much more financial cushion. I don't need to worry. And actually, you know what? I'm not going to buy an expensive house in London now. I'm going to live somewhere much cheaper. I might pop into the office once a week to see people, but the rest of the time I can work on Zoom. Finally, all of those worries about how on earth I was going to buy that expensive house and mortgage myself to the hill are going to disappear. House prices will then change quite markedly, particularly, etc. We just don't know how this plays out, but that more cocooning domestic life might appeal to millions of people for some time to come. We also have for brands, we've seen people like General Mills, who make things like Cheerios, pouring millions into advertising, because some of the evidence is that brands with purpose, but brands that are trusted and familiar, do better in times of crisis. We don't want to try the latest thing. When we're under pressure and we're feeling anxious, we buy the thing that we used to buy. We buy the thing we grew up with. We've also got, of course, brands behaving well and badly. And one of those, of course, is examples of people like LVMH, or in this example, the Bavaria Beer Company in Europe, turning into a manufacturer of hand sanitizer. So will we see some, a different sort of brand marketplace? Supermarkets sticking to rather fewer things, and the trusted brands winning, big and safe, and brands with purpose winning out? We don't know. And also, of course, we are seeing a massive change in the size of the state. The magic money tree that Mrs. May said did not exist has turned out to exist on steroids. We've now got governments all over the world basically paying millions and millions of people's wages, both in America and in Britain, all over Europe. Will we see actually now, as a result of this crisis, something like the end of World War II, where people fundamentally expected government to intervene in ways that before the crisis were not going to happen? Will we see much higher levels of taxation there in future to pay for it? Already, when you got intelligent people in the room, you saw most people saying, actually, in the 2020s, we're going to have to pay more tax in order to pay for things. And will America, if the disease carries on and it's in the way that it has in New York, if that was to happen across the whole of American society, would you see America becoming perhaps a bit more like it used to be in terms of equality, and actually having something a bit more akin to a national health service? Only time will tell. So, finally, I'll just say, predicting the future, as I hope I've shown you, is hard, but there are some pretty clear signals in here about what might emerge over the next period. It's absolutely the case that, as Darwin said, the things that survive are not the biggest, they're not the strongest, they are the most adaptable. And that, I think, is a message to all of us, particularly if you're like me, running a large business and seeing your revenue, your revenue is going to fall, and you're just plotting exactly what you're going to do, and also how you're going to pivot your business to the new reality. But it's certainly going to be about adaptability. And I think I'll stop there. There's one or two, so it is letting me go forward a bit, but let me skip that because it's boring. I want to keep to time. There's a website called Ipsos Global Trends, which gives you all of this data. There are some interesting questions, which I'm happy to answer now. So is the election of Keir Starmer as a leader of the game changer in British politics? Not yet. He's got more people who think he's going to be a good thing than a bad thing. But we'll see. Will we see a different approach to globalization? I think that's absolutely very possible, because it's certainly a wake-up call. If you're dependent on China to produce everything you need and suddenly it's not available, it's likely that we will see more inbuilt resilience, or certainly supply chains changing in a different way. Coronavirus and climate change, I'm not the expert, but I think the answer is that warming, and also basically the encroachment of human beings on animal habitat, which is what is happening all over the world, leading to mass extinctions, makes it more likely that we will see zoomorphic type diseases like this, where things spread from animals to humans, because we mix together in ways that we weren't doing 50 years ago.
Thank you very much. That's absolutely excellent. And we've got some lovely comments coming from people as well. And just to let everybody know, the slides will be available. We'll upload this onto the YouTube channel, but also we'll have the slides on our website, so you can refer back to them. I expected nothing less. Absolutely fascinating. I think we've got a few extra questions. We haven't really got time, but what we'll do is we'll ask Ben to perhaps answer these, and maybe we can send some answers and more out to you all. But thank you again, Ben. Thank you. And our next Movers and Shakers virtual event will be next Thursday. It's going to be a conversation with Chris Griggs, so one of our views from the top, so something to look forward to. Thank you all for attending this morning. Stay safe, and from our families to yours, thank you. Thank you, Ben.